Palestine! Long live Palestine! Long live Palestine! Long live Palestine! Long live Palestine! We're sending a strong message today. Let me hear you say free, free! Free, free! Free, free! Free, free! Free, free! Make some noise for yourselves! In our thousands, in our millions! 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 In our thousands, in our millions!
Israel, shame on you! 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 Netanyahu! Netanyahu, shame on you! Netanyahu! Shame on you! Israel, shame on you! Israel! Shame on you! Free, free! Palestine! Free, free! Palestine! Free, free! Palestine! Free, free! Palestine! From the river to the sea! Palestine will be free! From the river to the sea! Palestine will be free! No justice! No justice! No justice! No justice! Free, free! Palestine! Free, free! Palestine! Free, free!
Long live Palestine!
Okay, welcome to Zoom Palestine. This is Jackie Taylor Basker. I'm coming to you from Brooklyn, where I've been on emergency grandma duty, taking care of my grandchildren since my daughter's mother-in-law is gravely ill with cancer in Florida, and I finally put the children on the plane last night to see them. So I'm here. Good morning, Syed. So this has been a very difficult and traumatic week for those of us who love Palestine. We're dealing with a Israeli behavior, which has really, in a way, revealed the sadistic quality of the occupation and reconfirms our need to resist and to fight what's going on. There are denials of any Israeli complicity that much of the press has now is acknowledging the guilt and sadistic violence of Israel's forces, and we're going to be discussing that in depth. But other things that we talk about, the massacre that changed Gaza, bombing. There's a very good article about the ongoing problem in Gaza and the restrictions on women cause family ruptures in Gaza, and the travel. And this is because they're not letting them travel. So let's look at that for a minute and see what they say that that a Wafa, 28-year-old business administration graduate, recently lost a job in Turkey because she couldn't leave Gaza. Her obstinate father, who was objecting to her traveling abroad alone. And his reasoning: a woman should not face life challenges without a man to protect her, either a husband, father, or brother. So and the Gaza Supreme Judicial Council adopted legislation allowing a male guardian to get a court order barring a woman or girl from traveling if doing so puts them at risk. And this is following the model of Saudi Arabia, which has had travel restrictions. When I was teaching in Bahrain, I could not get to visit Saudi Arabia because I didn't have a male accompanying me. So what exactly puts them at risk? or absolute harm in the language of the registration is left ambiguous, perhaps intentionally so. The upshot is if a girl's guardian, a father, grandfather, brother, or uncle obtains a court order prohibition, she'll be barred from leaving Gaza even before a judge reaches a decision. This is what happened to Wafa, who did not want to give her real name for the order. She had a job offer from a Turkish company as a content writer. When she told her father she was planning to leave, he refused his permission. Her brother also was not to be moved. Now, this woman is 28 years old. She's not, 16. So so this was, she wrote, I had a glimmer of hope every time I tried to persuade my father and brother to embrace the notion of my travel, but they always let me down, she said. Shortly after receiving notification from the employer that I would lose the job if I didn't get there soon, I tried one final time with my family, but nothing changed. Now, the Human Rights Watch, has condemned the judicial decision, which the New York-based rights group violates women's right to leave their own country without discrimination under international human rights law. And they mentioned a case of Afaf al-Najjar, 19, who was denied the opportunity to pursue her bachelor's degree in Turkey last summer after her father issued a travel suspension offer. But she contends her family also destroyed her ambitions with sky-high unemployment rate, over 50%. Many young people see no option but to leave Gaza to further themselves in their careers. Wafa's own brother was allowed to leave and seek his fortune outside Gaza, making her even angrier when she eventually lost the job in Turkey. I isolated myself in my bedroom for weeks away from my family and friends, she said, after they smashed my ambitions to work outside. I felt my life had become meaningless. Her work as a search engine optimizer, content writer in Gaza earns her a little more than most other jobs available, but everyone is troubled by Gaza's desperate economy. Wafa still dreams of leaving. So this is a violation of international law, and it's very sad to see the government in Gaza burying the ambitions of women. So that's a problem that people that the Gazans face, not only oppression from Israel, but by their own court orders. There are 3 people who were killed this week over tensions over the holy sites. Here's a group of Jewish nationalists visit Jerusalem's Al-Aqsa Mosque compound under police escort May 5th, and Israel carried out a manhunt on Friday for 2 Palestinians suspected of killing 3 Israelis and seriously injured 2 others in Elad. Israeli authorities named the Palestinians, and meanwhile, dozen Palestinians were killed by Israeli occupation forces in Jenin over the past several weeks. Israeli movement restrictions and violence in that area escalated after Raed Hazem from the Jenin refugee camp shot and killed 3 Israelis in Tel Aviv on April 7th. He was killed in what they claim was a shootout. On Friday, they issued an order to demolish the apartment belonging to his family. Such punitive home demolitions, which Israel carries out against the families of Palestinians, it says, who carried out attacks on Israelis, but never against Jews who attack Palestinians, are a form of collective punishment, which is a violation under international law. This is the continual abuse by Israel of international law. And we also know that was a cover-up Israeli court approves the mass forced transfer of Palestinians, demolishing their homes. And here's a video on their website revealing Israeli cover-up in the killing of Palestinian citizens. So Israel continues its nefarious behavior in treating Palestinians by total violation of international law. and any kind of humanitarian compassion or respect. So we're going to look at the death of our beloved Shireen Abu Akleh and through the eyewitness. So here's the very good video that amazingly enough was on American media.
2022. On May 11th, 2022, Israeli forces killed Shireen Abu Akleh, a veteran Al Jazeera journalist and a Palestinian American.
وما توقف إطلاق النار رغم إنه شيرين كانت موجودة على الأرض.
But Israel didn't see Shireen's death as a human rights issue. It saw it as a PR problem. And so the disinformation started.
על פי הנתונים הראשוניים שבידינו, ישנו סיכוי לא מבוטל שהעיתונאית נפגעה בכלל מירי הפלסטינים החמושים.
But eyewitness accounts and video analysis all point to Israeli gunfire. Here's what we know happened. Shireen was covering an Israeli raid in Jenin, a city in the north of the occupied West Bank. She was wearing a helmet and a flak jacket, which clearly identified her as press. Shireen was shot behind her ear, underneath the helmet, killed by Israeli fire. Journalist Sheda Hanaisha was standing right next to Shireen when she was shot.
واضح يعني اللي قتلها يعني كان قاصد انه يصيبها في مكان هي ظاهر من جسمها مش مرتديه فيه الخوذه فيعني انا بعتبر اللي حدث هو جريمه اغتيال إلنا.
And it isn't just one eyewitness account. There were multiple people who all said the same thing.
احتلال كان مصر يقتلنا عبر القناصه وقعت شيرين وهي لابسه بريس. مع ذلك من حاول الإنقاذ كان يطلق عليه النار.
But it didn't matter what eyewitnesses said. Israel's goal was to deny responsibility and create confusion, and it did so deliberately by blaming Palestinians. A few hours after the shooting, Israeli Prime Minister Naftali Bennett tweeted out this video, saying that Palestinians were firing indiscriminately and falsely suggested that Palestinians were responsible for Shireen's death. And that suggestion then led to many mainstream media outlets creating headlines like these. This isn't just coincidence. The Israeli government knows how to use its statements to manipulate mainstream media. An official even took credit for their, quote, PR blitz, saying they had successfully influenced the Associated Press and BBC's coverage to cast doubt over who had killed Shireen. But here's the thing. According to witnesses at the location where Shireen was shot,
اللي ما كانش فيه لا مسلحين ولا مدنيين ولا في أي إطلاق نار.
Ali Sammoudi is another journalist who was shot at the scene. His eyewitness testimony immediately debunked Israel's claims.
الاحتلال القاتل والمجرم قام بإطلاق النار علينا دون أي سبب. أنا أصبت بالظهر والزميل الرصاص الثاني أصابت شيرين وأدى إلى استشهادها.
But the most damning rebuttal came from Beit Tselem, a leading Israeli human rights organization. Beit Tselem researchers actually analyzed the video shared by the Israeli government. They went and refilmed the location to show that the Palestinians in this video were not responsible for Shireen's death because there was virtually no way their bullets could have reached her.
I think it's worth pointing out that this propaganda line was propagated by no less than the Israeli Prime Minister, Foreign Minister, Defense Minister, other ministers, and the IDF spokesperson.
It was only after Beit Tselem's video that anyone in the Israeli government walked back the claim blaming Palestinians for Shireen's death. Israel's army chief then issued a statement saying we cannot determine by whose fire she was harmed. But the disinformation had already gone out, and the end goal was still to confuse and create more headlines like this. Israel demanded a joint investigation with the Palestinians, which the Palestinian Authority denied.
أننا قد رفضنا ونرفض التحقيق المشترك مع السلطات الإسرائيلية لأنها هي التي ارتكبت الجريمة ولأننا لا نثق بهم.
But Israel continues to shift blame towards Palestinians.
מהרשות הפלסטינית לא לעשות שום צעד לשיבוש החקירה או לזיהום תהליך החקירה בצורה שלא נוכל להגיע לחקר האמת.
Israel's military occupation kills hundreds of Palestinians every year. Last year, they killed 313 Palestinians, 71 of whom were minors. Most of them don't get the coverage Shireen's killing has received. But since Shireen was a prominent international journalist, the widespread outrage has forced Israel's biggest ally, the United States, to chime in. Still, the State Department was careful to not condemn Israel, even though Shireen was a US citizen.
Israel has the wherewithal and the capability to conduct a thorough, comprehensive investigation. They've done it before, and we expect they'll do so in this case.
Israel's military now says it's considering the possibility that an Israeli soldier shot Shireen. But here's the problem. Israel investigating itself typically never leads to any meaningful measures of accountability. Like in 2014, when an Israeli airstrike killed 4 children on a beach in Gaza. Israel said it was targeting a Hamas compound, but eyewitnesses said it was just a hut the kids were using to play hide and seek. After investigating itself, Israel determined that it was an accident and exonerated itself from any wrongdoing. Then there's the example of how Israeli forces killed a 78-year-old Palestinian-American man just earlier this year. Omar Asad was gagged and handcuffed by Israeli soldiers during a raid in the middle of the night. He died from a stress-induced heart attack caused by his injuries while he was detained.
They were hitting him, pulling him out of the car, dragging him a couple of 200-300 meters. They left him dead and they walked away from there.
So what was the punishment for causing a 78-year-old's death? The commanders of the platoon that conducted the raid were removed from their position and won't be allowed to serve as commanders for 2 years. No jail time, no external investigation, no justice for the victim's family. As some of you know, I'm Palestinian American, and I've reported from the occupied West Bank for AJ+. I've seen firsthand how Israeli forces target journalists, especially journalists who are Palestinian.
I don't speak Hebrew. I'm an American. Okay.
They are violent, aggressive, and show little regard for the freedom of press. There's a clear, systematic pattern here. In recent years, Israel has increased its attacks on members of the media with virtual impunity. Just 1 year ago, Israel bombed and flattened the offices of Al Jazeera and the Associated Press in Gaza, alleging that Hamas had used the building to fire rockets. Israel never provided Al Jazeera or the AP any evidence for its claim. Both news organizations denied the presence of any Hamas members in the building. And even when journalists have worn clearly marked protective gear saying press, Israeli forces have shot and killed them anyway, just like they did with Ahmed Abu Hussein and Yasser Murtaja in Gaza in 2018, and just like they did with Shireen in the occupied West Bank in 2022. This story is quite personal because I knew Shireen as a colleague and a friend. For years, I had watched her trailblazing reporting across the occupied Palestinian territories and looked up to her as a role model. I met Shireen in 2010 at the beginning of my career at Al Jazeera and was excited to get to know the woman who had long inspired me and countless others to become journalists. Shireen was kind, loving, humble, and fierce, and she'll be remembered as a brilliant, intrepid journalist who was the voice of the Palestinian people and their struggle for freedom. She put her life on the line for over 20 years to tell their stories, and her death is a devastating loss. Shireen touched so many of us in person, but also by her inspiring example. And the best way in which we can honor her courageous legacy is to redouble our own commitment to report the truth and the reality of life under Israeli occupation.
Well, that was certainly an excellent article that excellent coverage where we see the dispute going on where Israel claims that the Palestinians shot Shireen. However, that Salam, the Israeli peace group, tracked the video of the exact area where the Palestinians were shooting, and there was no way that any of the Palestinian bullets could have reached Shireen. So thanks to the Israeli peaceniks, that Israel now changed their story and said, well, maybe there may have been the Israeli in it, and they're doing an investigation. But as we've talked about before, the investigation by Israel is always very problematic. And I'm going to read a very powerful article by in Haaretz. Here's a picture showing protesters holding candles and a photo of the slain Al Jazeera journalist Shireen Abu Akleh in Haifa. And I'm going to read an article that demonstrates by Gideon Levy, one of my favorite journalists, that demonstrates the underlying problem. Good morning, Muhammad Ali. And this is a problem that the peace-loving Israelis have, who want peace, who want the end of the occupation. And he writes this: the relative horror expressed over the killing of Shireen Abu Akleh is justified and necessary. It is also belated and self-righteous. Now you're appalled? The blood of a famous journalist, no matter how brave and experienced she was, is no redder than the blood of an anonymous high school student who was traveling home in a taxi full of women in this same Jenin a month ago when she was killed by gunfire from Israeli soldiers. That is how Hanan Kadur was killed. Then, too, the military spokesman tried to cast doubt on the shooter's identity. Quote, the matter is being examined. A month has passed, and this examination has yielded nothing, and never will. But the doubts were planted, and they sprouted in the Israeli fields of denial and suppression, where no one actually cares about the fate of a 19-year-old Palestinian girl, and the country's dead conscience is silenced again. Is there a single crime committed by the military that the right and the establishment will ever accept responsibility for? Just one. Abu Akleh seems to be another story. An internationally known journalist. Just this past Sunday, a more local journalist, Asel al-Adr, was attacked by Israeli soldiers in the South Hebron Hills, and no one cared. And a couple of days later, 2 Israelis who attacked journalists during the Gaza war last May were sentenced to 22 months in prison. What punishment will be meted out to the soldiers who killed, if indeed they did, Abu Akleh? And what punishment was given to whoever decided on and carried out the despicable bombing of the Associated Press offices in Gaza during the fighting last year? Has anyone paid for this crime? And what about the 13 journalists who were killed during the Gaza war in 2014? And the medical personnel who were killed during demonstrations at the Gaza border fence, including 21-year-old Razan al-Najjar, who was shot dead by soldiers while wearing her white uniform. No one has been punished. Such things will always be covered by a cloud of blind justification and automatic immunity for the military and worship of its soldiers. Even if the smoking Israeli bullet that killed Abu Akleh is found, and even if footage is found that shows the face of the shooter, he will be treated by Israelis as a hero who is above all suspicion. It's tempting to write that if innocent Palestinians must be killed by Israeli soldiers, better for them to be well known and holders of US passports like Abu Akleh. At least then the US State Department will voice a little displeasure, but not too much, about the senseless killing of one of its citizens by the soldiers of one of its allies. At the time of writing, it was still unclear who killed Abu Akleh. This is Israel's propaganda achievement, sowing doubts, which Israelis are quick to grab onto as fact and justification. Though the world does not believe them, and is usually correct. When the young Palestinian boy Mohammed al-Dura was killed in 2000, Israeli propaganda also tried to blunt the identity of his killers. It never proved its claims, and no one bought them. Past experience shows that the soldiers who killed the young woman in a taxi are the same soldiers who might kill a journalist. It's the same spirit. They are permitted to shoot as they please. Those who weren't punished for Hanan's killing continued with Shireen. But the crime began long before the shooting. So let me read these talking points here. Israel proposed joint probe into journalist death, but didn't tell the Palestinians. Reporter killed in Israeli raid was U.S. citizen. Ambassador urges thorough investigation. Shireen Abu Akleh was more than a journalist. She was a Palestinian symbol. But the crime begins long before the shooting. The crime starts with the raiding of every town, refugee camp, village, and bedroom in the West Bank every night, when necessary, but mainly when not necessary. The military correspondents will always say that this was done for the sake of, quote, arresting suspects, without specifying which suspects and what they're suspected of. And resistance to these incursions will always be seen as a breach of order, an order in which the military can do as it pleases and the Palestinians cannot do anything. Certainly not show any resistance. Abu Akleh died a hero doing her job. She was a braver journalist than all Israeli journalists put together. She went to Jenin and many other occupied places where they have rarely, if ever, visited. And now they must bow their heads in respect and mourning. They also should have stopped spreading the propaganda spread by the military and government regarding the identity of her killers. Until proven otherwise, beyond any shadow of a doubt, the default conclusion must be the Israeli military killed Shireen Abu Akleh. So, good morning, Muhammad Ali. This is a very powerful statement by Gideon Libby, one of my favorite journalists, about the complicity of the Israeli journalists in not covering the crimes of the Israeli military, and also the futility of anybody trying to ever prosecute any Israeli soldier. They'll never be prosecuted if they get accused and found guilty of anything. Their sentence is a slap on the wrist. So basically, the Israeli soldiers are given a green light to do whatever they want. And actually, in our last program, we mentioned that Naftali has actually said after the three Israelis were shot in Tel Aviv last month, gave a green light to the army to do what was necessary. So whatever is necessary, as far as the army is concerned, is just to kill as many Palestinians as possible. So now we're going to continue to look at the coverage. So we've talked about the shooting of Shireen, but now to compound the guilt of the Israeli military, we see what happened when she had her funeral. Shireen was a Christian, and she was being taken from the hospital in a coffin to the church. And the Palestinians usually have processions holding the coffin high. And then she was going to be taken from the church to the ancient Christian cemetery in Mount Zion. where she would be buried next to her mother. Well, Israel wasn't content with just killing her. They wanted to kill her funeral as well. So there were soldiers who refused to allow the funeral procession to happen and began attacking the mourners with batons in the most sadistic fashion, unimaginable from a civilized point of view. So let's see, let's read about that horrible situation. And we have a video on that as well. Okay, so the second video. Okay, here we go. Now this is going to talk about the funeral procession that was disrupted by the Israeli police.
New video shows Israeli police clashing here with a crowd of mourners who appear to have been beaten with batons, actually causing the pallbearers to briefly drop Shireen's casket. So many allegations have been made since Shireen's death. Her network Al Jazeera accusing Israel of, quote, blatant murder, while the Israeli military now says it is investigating whether the fatal shot came from one of its soldiers. We brought you this story this week when witnesses came forward saying that the journalist was shot and killed by Israeli forces while covering a military raid on Wednesday in the occupied West Bank. Joining me now, award-winning Palestinian journalist and former professor of journalism at Princeton University, Daoud Khattab, and president and CEO of Americans for Peace, now also a former IDF soldier, Hadar Suskin. We appreciate both of you so much for being here. Daoud, I want to start with you. You knew Shireen personally. Let's just start by talking about her work and her legacy.
You know, there are a lot of TV journalists who are quite emotional, but Shireen was one of the few journalists in the Arab world that was extremely unemotional. She presented the news, she presented the facts. She was always on the field. She only reported what she saw in her own eyes. And people really appreciated the facts that she was transmitting. She was really well known. She became a household. I mean, since 2000, almost every night she's on television. People saw her and became, and they were so happy to hear her. And they were so sad when she was killed in such a way. It was terrible.
So, Daoud, let me ask you, as a former Palestinian journalist covering Israeli-Palestinian tensions for so many years, did you ever feel that you were a target? And do you believe that, yes?
Look, the Israelis deal differently, obviously. Normally, if you're accredited, and only very few Palestinians are accredited, you have to work for an international agency to be accredited. Now, what happened to Shireen happened in the early morning hours of Wednesday in one of the furthest locations from the center of Palestine, Israel, in Jenin. So, and it also happened when the Israeli government said that they're removing all restrictions on the army. So the army basically was given a free hand. And when you have underarm or, you have Israeli troops that are trying to do an operation and they see a camera, well, they want to get rid of it. And so in this case, it seems that they succeeded, unfortunately, by killing an icon, a really well-liked, loved icon who was also an American citizen and who's a Palestinian Christian. So, they unified Palestinians in a way that never has happened before. We saw tens of thousands of people in the old city today carrying her coffin, carrying Palestinian flags. And the Israelis tried to bring that down, and they couldn't stop the Palestinians from celebrating and, remembering her life.
No, she clearly had many people around her who loved her very much. But I do want to clarify with you where you stand, Daoud. Do you believe that Shireen was targeted for being Palestinian?
Well, I think she was targeted for being a journalist. I'm not sure that she was targeted for being Palestinian. I think they didn't expect journalists to be there at 6 a.m. on Wednesday. And they shot first one of her assistants and he ran away. And they apparently, because she didn't run away, she was killed. Did they want to kill her? Did they just want to scare her? We don't know. But clearly she was killed by Israelis because they didn't want cameras to be around when they did the operation that they were doing.
And we should point out that an investigation has begun. Israeli military said they are investigating if indeed she was shot by an Israeli soldier. Hadar, as an Israeli American and former IDF combat soldier, what was your initial reaction to Shireen's death?
My initial reaction is that it's just a terrible tragedy. And, you know, it's a tragedy, obviously, first and foremost, her death for her family, for her friends, but really her voice and her work and the loss of that's been so important, as Daoud said, to the Palestinian people, to the Arab world. And, you know, it remains to be seen what kind of investigation will happen. You know, an Israeli cabinet minister himself said that they don't have tremendous credibility investigating their own work. So we are certainly calling for an independent investigation, and I hope that will be forthcoming.
So when you served with the IDF, had you ever known a Palestinian journalist to be targeted? And do you believe that the IDF could have purposely targeted Shireen for being either a Palestinian journalist or just a journalist?
Well, I certainly never had any personal experience like that. My service is quite some time ago already, and I never saw anything like that. You know, was she targeted? Was that intentional? I don't know. You know, I will say again, I think that's why we need an investigation. And I think, you know, there's a question of what does it mean to be targeted as well. There's no doubt that the IDF doesn't want journalists filming these things, doesn't want cameras around their actions. As Daoud said, whether they intended to scare her off or intended to kill her, I don't know.
And Hadar, just to take a step back here, we're having this conversation because a Palestinian journalist and as a former IDF soldier, we have the two of you representing both sides here as an Israeli and a Palestinian. What does this tell you just about this moment and the larger implications of Shireen's death?
I think it is again, terrible and unfortunate reflection of the situation that we have right now and how fraught it is, how fraught that conflict is, and how fragile that, you know, one action, whether it was intentional, as certainly many believe, or accidental, can be the match that sets things aflame. And frankly, the response today, the reason we're talking today, was not only her death on Wednesday, but the funeral today, and seeing the response from the Israeli police today. I don't know how anybody, including me, a former IDF soldier, can look at that and think that that's about Israel's security, or that is somehow about anything other than just violence.
Appreciate your transparency very much by saying that, Hadar. And Daoud, you know, what do you think should happen now with this investigation? What do you want to see?
Well, I want to see an end to occupation, because really, whatever the reason was, the Israeli soldiers should not be in Jenin. They should not be in the West Bank. It's the occupied areas. Normally, occupations last a few years. This has been a 50-some-year occupation, and it has to end. And things happen when there is a continued hostile occupation. People resisted. We're all supporting the Ukrainians for resisting the Russians. Why isn't people also saying Palestinians have a right to live freely in their own country without an occupation? This is the real problem. And we need to stop trying to negate the nationalism of the other. The Palestinian flag is not illegal. Palestinians have a right to raise their flag, just like the Israelis have a right to raise their flags. We need a two-state solution. Otherwise, let's have a one-state binational state. But to keep the status quo, keep Palestinians under occupation, is not going to resolve the problem.
Hadar, White House Press Secretary Jen Psaki just spoke about Shireen's funeral. Let's take a listen to what she said.
This is a day where we should all be marking, including everyone there, the memory of a remarkable journalist who lost her life. We know that there is, with the disturbing footage from the funeral procession today in Jerusalem, we regret the intrusion into what should have been a peaceful procession. We've urged respect for the funeral procession, the mourners, and the family at this sensitive time. We're also in close touch with Israeli and Palestinian authorities, have been and obviously will continue to be, especially given the images we've seen today. We're not currently involved in any of the investigation, but we are working to bridge cooperation and available to provide assistance as needed.
What did you think of that response, Hadar? And what more is your organization asking should be done?
Well, I think the important sentence there was when the press secretary said that the U.S. is not currently involved, because they should be involved and they need to be involved. And we need to see, again, a credible, independent investigation. But also, I think what Bill just said was incredibly important. This investigation, this issue, this incident is tragic and is important, but the issue on the table is 55 years of occupation. And that's where the government needs to be involved. And that's what my organization, Americans for Peace Now, is working for, is calling for. The US government and governments going back, Democrats and Republicans, excepting the last administration, have all been opposed to the occupation. They've all been opposed to settlement expansion. They've all called for two-state solution. President Biden and this administration stands strongly by all of those things. We need to see them put action behind those words. We need to see them engage with the Israelis, engage with the Palestinians, engage with the international community to take real, meaningful steps to end this occupation and bring about that two-state solution.
Daoud Khattab and Hadar Suskin, I really appreciate you both coming on together and having this discussion with me. Appreciate it very much.
Hi, everyone. George Stephanopoulos here. Thanks for checking out the ABC News.
Well, I found that quite amazing that's American media, ABC News, actually challenging Israel's version of the events of Shireen's murder and having people from peace groups on. This is quite a turn of events. So I feel somehow Shireen's death has not and will not be in vain. So we have a few minutes left before we go on to the Canadian Voice for Peace Zoom meeting that I'll be showing you on Facebook Live from noon, which is on how art can be used, how the important role art holds in resistance. So we're going to just quickly, I'm going to show you this segment by Ali Belchi because we're not going to have time for the Al Jazeera segment. So let's look at Ali.
Thousands filled the streets of Ramallah in the occupied West Bank today, where the Palestinian presidential compound, a state-run memorial service, was being held for Shireen Abu Akleh. She was a longtime correspondent for Al Jazeera, a Palestinian-American woman, and yesterday she was shot and killed while reporting on a raid by Israeli forces in the town of Jenin in the occupied West Bank. She died after being shot in the head, though she was wearing a helmet. The producer was shot and injured as well. They were wearing clearly labeled press jackets. Both were veteran journalists, and they were there doing their jobs, bearing witness for those of us who are not there. The situation in the occupied West Bank has been heating up for a while now. Unfortunately, for the past 5 years or so, the United States has been largely absent from the conflict, but the violence has been escalating. One of the great difficulties in this conflict, which Palestinians argue goes back to the 1948 exodus of some 700,000 Arabs from their homes when the State of Israel was founded, is that it's sometimes hard to parse who's telling the truth about what's actually going on the ground, which is why journalists like Shireen Abu Akleh matter. They are there in the thick of it, exposing themselves to.
And then today we all wake up to the news about Shireen, not Shireen giving the news. And I really think that strikes a chord.
Okay, we're going to end now because we have our next session, which is the Zoom session covering the Canadian Voices for Peace discussion of the use of art as a way of protest, that how do the arts contribute to activism? And I think all artists, whether they're painters, musicians, writers, poets, are cut to the core with this latest death and desecration of her funeral, and their art will reflect the spirit, the zeitgeist of all of us who mourn her. So I welcome you. Thank you for joining us for this session. We're going to be continuing our coverage, and we'll continue the Al Jazeera program next week. So blessings on everyone on your day. And I hope your hearts will heal from this terrible event. And tomorrow I'm going to be live at a protest in Brooklyn, at Bay Ridge, Brooklyn, celebrating Aqla Day. So it will be on Facebook Live. So stay tuned. And we will be talking to many people here in New York who are going to be grieving her at this Nakba commemoration tomorrow. So that's at 1 o'clock in New York time. I believe 6 o'clock, I think in Paris time, or 7 o'clock in Paris time, and 8 o'clock in Jerusalem, Middle East time. So thank you everybody on Facebook, Mohammed, Amin, Imram, Mush Khan, and Syed Ayaz. Thank you for joining me. And if you want to stay on for the next hour and watch this Canadian Voices for Peace panel, I'm going to put it on. So see you in a few minutes. Bye. See you next week. Bye.